Hello, everyone. This is the first case study in the evolutionary unit. We're going to start with a sort of a traditional case. I think most of you have probably heard of this and can recall a lot of the information from it. This is on Darwin's Finches and his idea of natural selection. And so this starts off with a story about Charles Darwin. He's kind of the founding member of the the idea of evolution and how organisms change, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he did a lot of his studying in what's called the Galapagos Islands, and that's where this case study is going to focus. So if you look at the map here, you can see this little white dot out here in the ocean. It's located approximately 1,000 kilometers from the coast of Ecuador, and that's a little closer than Chicago and Philadelphia would be on a map. So there's some distance there, and that's important. This is a Google Earth view of the Galapagos. So you can see multiple different islands there. The implication here is that terrestrial species on these islands won't have many relatives nearby. So terrestrial meaning land-based. Neighboring islands will have close relatives. But new terrestrial species won't arrive on these islands from South America. So the mainland of South America and these islands are sort of distantly related. There's not a lot of species that can cross between the islands. So most of the island species have had plenty of time to differentiate, and so we can see and study these as a sort of an individual lab experiment setup, basically. The key term here at the bottom is gene flow. So another way of saying this is that there's very little gene flow between the islands and the mainland. So I've got our first concept question here, and you don't need to be on Socrates to do this. But basically, think about this one here. Pause it for a moment if you need to. So limited gene flow means A, birds rarely move between the mainland and the islands. It's a long distance for them to fly without resting. And so Charles Darwin explored these islands from April through October of 1835. So his entire voyage of the Beagle was from December 1831 to October 1836. And this is where he started to come up with his idea of the evolution by natural selection, and we'll get to that towards the end of this case study also. He did not publish his thoughts until the publication in what's called The Origin of Species. It's a book he wrote in 1859. So it took him a while to sort of publicize what his findings were. So his ideas is that evolution is change in species over time. This was not a new idea, but there were no good, what we call mechanisms or ways to explain how these changes occur. And so natural selection was that mechanism. Galapagos has what's called endemics. So the Galapagos is an amazing place. Animals live there that are found nowhere else on Earth, so that makes them endemic. So basically that means they're only in this location. Perhaps the most famous of these are the endemic birds or the finches. There's 13 different species. And like I mentioned earlier, the islands make a natural laboratory, one that we can observe these changes in species in a very sort of controlled setting, but still being in nature. Some of the endemics you can see here, pictured to the right. So penguins and tortoises and lizards and sea lions and all kinds of different organisms there. So a lot of species that only live on the island. So endemic means, and again, pause it here. Think about this for a moment. So endemic means the species isn't found anywhere else, letter B. So Darwin studied the finches, and there's 13 finch species here. So 6 of ground, 3 of tree, woodpecker, vegetarian, mangrove, coca island. So basically a variety of different types of finches also. Then along came Peter and Rosemary Grant. And so these two scientists studied the finches also. They spent a long time on the island, so months at a time, and often got to know basically all the finches that were on the island. They were able to identify them, and they got to know them like we get to know one another in person. So they collected some data. Here's the graph showing that. So this is the graph showing the distribution of beak depths for medium ground finches in year 1. First year they were there. What's the average depth of the finch's beaks in year 1? So again, take a moment, pause this. Concept question 4. How much was the biggest difference in beak depth? Again, pause this. So for question 3 here, letter C is closest to the average, about 9.5 millimeters. So 9.5 millimeters is about the width of your pinky. How much was the biggest difference? The biggest difference was 8 millimeters. If you take the range from 5.9 to 13.9, that's about a difference of 8. So a change in the weather occurred in year 2 for Peter and Rosemary Grant. Like most years, some rain fell the first week of January. The rest of January, there was one small shower, and the total rainfall for the entire year was 24 millimeters, or 2.4 centimeters. That's about an inch of rain. So in a normal year, 130 millimeters of rain would fall. In year 1, previous year, 137 millimeters of rain fell. So this is going to have some effects, of course. The ground finches feed on seeds, and that's important for them to get food, of course. Year 1 in June, 1 square meter of lava on the island has over 10 grams of seeds. Year 2, that's reduced to 6. Year 2 December, that's reduced to 3. In the drought, the plants conserved their resources, did not produce seeds. So plants basically aren't getting enough energy because they're not getting enough water to do photosynthesis and things like that. Similarly, the finches did not mate and did not produce eggs in year 2. Seeds, and there's a variety of them on the island. Finches prefer the softest seeds. They're easy to open. The seeds above are seeds from a plant called caltrop. That's sort of this triangular shape that they're pointy. These are among the hardest to eat. Beaks need to be big to open them. So ground finches with beaks that are 10.5 long or less haven't seen even trying to eat them. So what do you think will happen to the size of the finch population between years 1 and 3? Remember, year 2 is a drought year. So sketch a rough graph. Which of the graphs on question 5 here best represent what you had drawn or what you predicted? Then we move on to year 3. So one day in January of year 3, more than 50 millimeters of rain fell on the island, so they got a lot of rain. Plants finally flowered and produced seeds. The Grants and their colleagues returned to the Galapagos. They found the finch population had been decimated. No new finches hatched in year 2. Only one finch born in year 1 survived to year 3. Here's year 3 data. If you look at the scale here, the number of finches has been greatly reduced from the previous graph. The red line indicates sort of the average. So question 6, what was the average beak depth in 1978? That was their 3rd year on the island. Remember, in 1976, it was 9.5 millimeters. So for question 6 here, letter D, it's just under 10. So it went from 9.5 millimeters to 10 millimeters. So 0.5 millimeters, which is a half of a centimeter. And so we define evolution in this first case study as a change in the frequency of an allele. We talked about alleles before. Alleles are like your eye color. So like the blue allele or the green allele or the brown allele, or blood types, the A allele for blood type A, B allele for blood type B, the O, which is the recessive allele. So alleles can be dominant or recessive. Such as an allele for beak depth is a basic definition of evolution. So, did the finch population evolve from 1976 to 1978? And the answer here is A, yes. Evolution by natural selection. The Grants first went to the Galapagos to take a quick snapshot of finch diversity. Within a few years, they saw natural selection occur. In the course of one season, the beaks got 0.54 millimeters deeper. That was the change we saw in the graphs, and 0.39 millimeters longer. Sex ratio also changed in the population. So with this, the beak size and shape was changing right before the Grant's eyes, and this is definitely evolution as we defined it earlier. So the key point here is that evolution is not necessarily like a new species being formed all of the time. It's how a population changes over time. Here's the example that I'll use. In this case, it went from 9.5 millimeters to 10 millimeters, which is about a 5% change. Now, that might not seem like very much. If we scale it to people, for example, say the average male human is 6 feet tall. 5% change of that 6 foot tall person is going to make that male 6'3" or almost 6'4". So is that a significant difference if you see someone who's 6 feet tall versus someone who's 6'3"? That's a pretty significant difference. When we look at these small numbers, sometimes it's misleading because it's just referring to beak sizes or beak depth, and those changes are small compared to us, but to the birds, to the finches, that is a significant change. So a couple surprising things came out of this. Evolution can occur quickly enough to be observed in a few field seasons. Darwin believed that we did not have a long enough lifespan to observe this, but we can, even from year to year. And a single weather event can cause that. And we'll see this with some other examples as we go through other case studies as well. They were, the nice thing here is the Grants were able to measure these very carefully. The birds got used to them over time, and so they could catch and measure them. And that's kind of how they use very precise tools and stuff like that. Which of these do you find most surprising? Heritability. So inheritance is key to evolution. So the inheritance of beak size from one generation to the other needs to be there. Without heritability, natural selection and evolution cannot occur. If beak sizes were just random, talking about the heights of people, if heights of people were just random, we know that those things are genetic, they're inherited. So that is a key part to understanding natural selection and how that can drive evolutionary change. So this is the big part to this case study, sort of the steps to natural selection. So I'm going to have you write these down. Individuals vary in some traits. So you had big beaks, small beaks, medium beaks. Number two, differences are in traits are passed along to offspring. They're inherited. They're heritable. They can be passed down. Step three, different individuals produce different numbers of surviving offspring. So basically, a big beak in this case, the big beaks were able to produce different numbers of offspring because they were able to get more food. The particular value of a trait is connected to the number of offspring produced. So big beaks are able to produce more offspring, and that's what it's being naturally selected for in this case. If beak depth increased during the drought due to selective mortality, can we really say that this natural selection was driven by environmental favoring the survival of birds with deeper beaks? Again, pause this if you would like. And the correct answer here is yes, B. Birds with deeper beaks survived at a higher rate than birds with shallower beaks. And so this comes from, I know this turns sideways with Google Docs here, The Beak of the Finch, A Story of Evolution in Time by Jonathan Weiner. So there's, this is the first case study. Go on and take the post quiz. and look for the next case study coming up.